All right, hi everybody, welcome.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, so welcome everybody to our second, I don't know, interview speaker lecture online on the interwebs. We are very, very happy to have Amaranth Borsuk with us today, and we'll do a brief introduction that Élika will do, and then we'll just start asking questions.
Yes,
Thank you
thank you,
for being
Amaranth,
here,
so much
Amaranth.
for joining us. I shortened your very, very long and accomplished bio, so hopefully I'm doing it justice to all of the wonderful things that you do. Amaranth Borsuk is an associate professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington, Bothell, where she also serves as an associate director of the MFA in Creative Writing and Poetics. Her work focuses on textual materiality from the surface of the page to the surface of language. Amaranth is amazingly prolific, and her work is exemplary of collaborative work. Her books include The Book, Pomegranate Eater, Abra, As We Know, Between Page and Screen, Town or So, and other projects include Whispering Galleries, Wave Science, and The Deletionist. All of these, or many of these, with collaborations with a really long list of wonderful people. You can find out more about Amaranth's work on her website, amaranthborsuk.com. And again, Amaranth, thank you so much. We have a few questions for you.
Thanks for having me.
Right. So right off the bat, I guess a very, very complicated question, but what is a book?
That's the big question. That's the $1,000,000 question. Yeah, and that's a question that probably each of us is going to have our own answer for. For the purposes of my book, the book, I have in mind a definition, but I don't necessarily think it's the only or the best definition. So when I talk about a book, I'm thinking about a portable information storage and retrieval technology. It's writable and readable, store and retrieve, and it can be taken with you somewhere. That's a very porous definition, because basically I wanted a definition that would allow me to talk about a vast range of artifacts that we've used historically and into the present moment that allow us access to textual and visual information. From, say, the Incan quipu, which is made by knotting strings of rope, or an ebook that's read on your Kindle or your iPhone. And the sort of like common denominator for me was write, read, portable. But I don't necessarily think that my definition is the only definition, and sort of part of the process of writing the book was trying to open up the space of the book to allow other voices in and to provide their definition. So you'll see, in your participants in this class will see that there are these large full-page quotes throughout the book that include definitions provided by other thinkers, practitioners, book artists, people coming from a vast range of experiences. And then I could only fit about 30 of those. Yes, exactly. There was only room for 30 of those in the book because of the press's restrictions. So after this book was published, I started this online project inviting 101 librarians, publishers, book artists, scholars, anyone who's really thinking about what books can be and do, to send me their definitions of the book. And I put those online. And I think you shared that link with your students as well. As a way of saying, like, there isn't just one way to think about what a book is. And that's basically the argument of my book, is that if when you hear the word book, all you picture is the codex, which is the stack of pages bound on one side and closed between covers, you're missing both a deeper history and a potential long future for how we read.
Excellent. So the second question we have is very, very close to what you're saying. There has been a lot and sometimes very tiresome talk about the death of the book since more or less the 80s, I would say. What has happened to the book, and I guess in this case I'm talking about the codex, in the digital age, and as in a mirror way, what has happened to the digital when it's in close proximity to the book, to codex materials, that is?
I think there are a few things that are happening to the book in the digital age. The primary thing is that the book has been dematerialized for a lot of people, that when we hear the word book, because we know we can access what feels to us like the same book in a paperback, hardcover, or Kindle, we're no longer necessarily seeing the book as an object, and we're seeing it more as a concept. And we're encountering it through these different interfaces. And each of these interfaces, although we may not realize it, absolutely impacts our experience of the book. It's a very different experience to read my book even on the Kindle versus to read it in the paperback edition. So in our like psyche, there's this dematerialization happening, and it's also a very literal dematerialization in that books are in this what Kate Hales calls the post-print condition, where they exist as data and they are transferable across digital platforms. So it's both a kind of, we've shifted the way we think about it, and the way that the text is manufactured and circulates has also changed. But one of the kind of paradoxes of this moment is, even as we're experiencing that dematerialization, there is a renewed interest in and attention to the book as a material artifact. So you're seeing more publishing experiments where, mass-produced books have really interesting physical forms, like Jonathan Safran Foer's book Tree of Codes, which is an erasure that's been cut out from the pages, which was, that's a risky book to publish. Or books like Anne Carson's Knox, which folds out in a long accordion in these beautiful full color images. And so even as we've got the dematerialization, there's also increased interest in the physical artifact, and also scholarship around book objects, and interest in book history is experiencing a surge now too. I don't, guessing your students would normally, as part of this class, do something like go to an archive or maybe make a physical book, but they are making things as part of this class too, which I think is an interesting approach. That sort of like, in order to think about text in this moment, you have to be engaged in experiencing what it's like to make it too.
Right. I mean, there is definitely an interest, or a renewed, or I don't know, the new age of textual materiality. So what about you in your particular case? Talk to us about your interest in textual materiality. How do you understand it? How do you approach it? Right.
Sure. My understanding and interest in textual materiality is really founded on reading Kate Hales' work. Almost, her idea of media-specific analysis, which can you imagine, it was 2002 when she published that, and yet it still feels very present. She was making an argument in 2002 that scholars of electronic literature and of literature more broadly need to take clue from people in book history and the book arts, and recognize that whenever you're analyzing a text, you have to analyze its material embodiment too. That you can't pretend that text doesn't have material form. And at the time, that was a really crucial argument to make, because we were coming out of a way of theorizing works of literature that really talked about them as separate from the author, separate from the physical artifact, separate from the capitalist system of distribution. So what's amazing is that argument still is really prescient and necessary, especially now in this digital moment, when it is kind of easy to think about a book without thinking about its physical form. Because we're reading so much on screens, there is a tendency to think about it in this kind of disembodied fashion, that it's just like a melding of your brain with a text. When in fact, of course, that's not true, right? When you read on a screen, when you read on a touch-based device, these interfaces involve the human body and involve the text's body in fundamental ways that change its meaning. So for me, that's how I'm understanding materiality on multiple levels, of trying to engage with the shape the text takes, the material platform through which we're accessing it, how it affects our own embodiment, and how it circulates in the world.
Yeah, that makes me think, just a little parenthesis, that makes me think when I was an undergrad student at UNAM, a lot of the reading materials that we would do for most classes, I think, we would get by photocopying the professor's book. So I think probably 75 let's say between 60 and 75% of what I read in undergrad were photocopies. And I'm pretty sure I would be a more canonical thinker if I hadn't used photocopies, but that really like put a distance between, you know, I guess me enjoying the text because it was just like stacks and stacks of photocopies.
Totally. It
Yeah.
totally shapes, and it probably shapes your memory of those texts that you read too. When you picture them in your mind's eye, the object you're picturing is very different from
Exactly
what either of us might be picturing when we talk about the same text.
Yeah,
Sure.
totally. Yeah. So one of the things that I find just totally mind-blowing and really, really different from the book is how you write a history of the book of sorts with giving the centrality really to artistic book practices. This is, I find, quite a departure from many other texts in book studies that tend to be more about printing, more about kind of like the trade, to a lesser extent, like, you know, the kind of like artistic practices like binding, which I'm very interested in, as you know. So I wonder if you could speak about your motivation to do this and why artist books have so much to say about the current textual media landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. So the computer glitched a little bit for me during your question, but I think I got the question. But I apologize in advance if I skip something. Feel free to like ping me and say, hey, you didn't touch on that.
All right.
For me, artist books are an essential component to understanding what books can be or do, because they're these kind of statistical outliers of experiments with book form. And I feel like sometimes you have to look at the margins to see the center. And because we are so used to the codex book and we no longer even see it as an object, it sort of takes artists destroying, dismantling, and reassembling it for us to recognize both how that form has historically functioned and how it could be exploited to make it do new things. So I find artist books extremely instructive because they're kind of frontline responses by people whose motivation is certainly not financial. They're not trying to sell something. It is expressive, and it's also exploratory. And I think that exploratory impulse, it comes from a place that really allows us to see the book with new eyes. So that's why artist books for me are a very useful test case and kind of example for how the book has historically changed and where it could be going. And I try to touch on many of the different themes because there's sort of themes that emerge throughout the 20th century as book artists experiment with objects that are shaped like books or that reference books. But I'm sure there are more than the ones that I talk about in the book. They were just sort of the ones that were the most pressing. But in each case, these themes that emerge, they both point us to aspects of the book that were already there that we may not have come to think of, like the fact that you can use a book like a film. Books can be animated. They can be more than simply a page turning experience. They can really be like a flip book experience. Or the fact that books, because they are made out of ephemeral materials, are subject to destruction and decay like the human body. We tend to think of the book as this very stable object that goes into archives, that goes into libraries and lasts millennia as a treasure trove of human thought and knowledge. And we don't necessarily think about the fact that historically, whenever one group of people is trying to overthrow another, one of the first things they do is destroy their trove of textual material as a way of sort of decimating their trove of intellectual thought that represents their culture. So I find artist books useful in pointing to some of these aspects of the book that are maybe things we know or that are sort of deeply embedded in our understanding of how books function, but that we've sort of forgotten about or we've glossed over in our very transactional relationship with books as access points to a text or to an author.
Yeah, I mean, this way of thinking of the book as something that, you know, exists in the world and it sort of suffers from the elements of the world, right? Just like every other thing. Kind of, it's a good way to think of the next question, perhaps. We were, as you know, we're very interested in materiality in this class, and we're thinking about it from different aspects and different ways. And one of the ways to think about materiality is this sort of external infrastructure that allows it to happen, right? Things are dependent on other things that are in the world. So it could be connectivity networks or economic systems or just the earth, right? Just the earth disintegrating, or taking the book to the beach and getting it soaked in water. So do you have any thoughts on how these bigger systems seep into your work? And you could talk about your academic or your creative practice, or if it's easier for you to think about other examples of other people's doing work.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a couple of ways that I'm thinking about infrastructures. In my more recent thinking about the book, I've been interested in the relationship between books and bodies. And so I was thinking about the book in the Anthropocene and this moment of real awareness of the human incursion into the environment and the instability of the world we're living in, something that you're experiencing firsthand right now with the wildfires in California.
See, all our books are going to burn.
Yeah, and
our computers too.
Right, everything. It's agnostic. Fire is agnostic.
It's a great equalizer.
Right. Terrible.
It's dark. I know.
But there was a really important moment in the history of book archivization when there was a massive flood in the city of Florence in the now I want to say it was in the 1960s. I should have looked up the date before we talked, but I didn't think about it. When was the Florence flood? It wasn't. It was later. It must have been in the late 70s, early 80s. A massive flood in Florence that destroyed a huge archive of historical texts and books that were extremely valuable and rare. And that became a flashpoint in book archiving that brought conservators together to figure out how to rescue these texts that were basically, saturated in mud and like river detritus and sewage. And a lot of the archival systems in place today and book conservation techniques in place today arose from the international exchange of ideas between book conservators around the world who sort of rushed to Florence to try and help rescue all of these books. It's not even something I would have known about had I not spent time both looking into artist books, because there are artist books commemorating this moment, because it was so pivotal for many book artists in thinking about the importance of the book as an artifact, and then in terms of sharing ideas and techniques with one another. And then also, working, when I was in graduate school, I worked at a letterpress lab and artist book studio at an arts college in Los Angeles. And people, some of the people who were there talked about it and had been involved at the time. And so hearing about this moment that otherwise really it's like such a specialist moment, but one that really relied on the international exchange of ideas around how to conserve and take care of these books. So that, to me, that's a fascinating moment in the history of the book that most of us don't think about. The other related concept that springs to mind is the ecosystem of electronic literature, and the ways in which so often when you are making a work of electronic literature, you're reliant upon software, you're reliant upon hardware that you haven't designed, and that therefore you have a limited amount of control over. I mean, there are certainly many people who code their works from the ground up, and yet even so, as technologies change, you're constantly having to update and upgrade your works of electronic literature so that they maintain some accessibility. So on my collaboration, Abra, which is an artist's book that also includes a free app that the reader can play with. We got a grant to do that explicitly stated we had to develop Abra in the iOS. It had to be made for iPhones and iPads. And my collaborator on that, Ian Hatcher, is someone who believes really strongly in open source software. And like him, I really wanted the project Abra to be something that belonged to readers as much as it belonged to the artifact of the book, and that it could potentially be manipulated and changed through the process of others accessing the code. And that's just not possible with iOS. It is such a closed system, and it's designed to be that way so that you don't know what's going on underneath your screen. So we had a lot of big conversations about that with the Center for Book and Paper Arts in Chicago. You know, is there a way to get around this? And there really wasn't. So we ended up having to embrace it, and Ian learned to code in iOS, and he learned, you know, how to exploit the affordances of the iPad, and then made his code available on GitHub so that someone who has the time and energy can potentially port it into a more open format. So that the ways in which these infrastructures can keep you out has been something that I've encountered. And I know you also have talked about Flash and the potential death of Flash, which is something that my collaborator Brad Bass and I—
certain death, right? Certain death.
Right. I mean, there are all of these ways in which technologies die, and then scholars and intrepid media archaeologists find ways to restore them or maintain our access to them. Or I guess if we're talking about death, we have to have a metaphor like revivify them. Would that be what they're doing, or Frankensteining them? So works that were available in Flash, or at least so Brad tells me, my collaborator on Between Page and Screen, they can still potentially exist as long as someone has access to Flash on their computer, which means you'll have to have some sort of standalone Flash install. But Adobe's not going to update it or upgrade it, and won't be actively supporting it. So once it breaks, it breaks. Our goal is to release a version of Between Page and Screen that's JavaScript, that is, you know, probably would be even faster and would work even better than the version that's currently in Flash. But that's also subject to Brad having the time to recode the whole book, which is not a small ask in the least. And the funny thing is that when we first created Between Page and Screen, and I'm sure there are interviews with me and talks I gave where I probably said explicitly that the project was going to die, and that we knew that Flash had a limited lifespan because at the time it was not being supported on iPads and iPhones. So we knew as soon as Apple announced that they wouldn't support it, we knew that it was going to disappear. And at the time I was saying, like, it's very Fluxus, and it's very, you know, the work of art will disappear and all that will be left is documentation of people photographing themselves holding it in front of their webcam. And I was probably like fresh out of grad school and very utopian about that, and I think pretty cavalier. What I didn't anticipate was that people would want to study it and would want to teach it and would want to translate it. And now I feel a kind of emotional beholdenness to the community of readers that I didn't expect, that sprouted up in support of Between Page and Screen. And I would like for them to be able to keep teaching and reading and thinking about that work for as long as it's useful to them. I mean, at some point it's not useful anymore. Like, the conversation can be over. But I think my own emotional guilt about that potential inaccessibility makes me want to commit to making that work available for as long as we are able to make it available. But I don't know when that's going to be. So there could be a period in which the work is defunct.
Yeah, and I mean, it is such a central work in the last
Don't
10
guilt
years
her.
of-
Don't guilt her.
No, I'm not guilting. I'm admiring.
Thank you.
No,
Super honored.
I really do. So, I mean, not to tell you like, hurry up, make sure this is still working. But I mean,
What
that's
am
why
I
the
going to teach
community.
now?
Yeah, what am I gonna teach? But really, like, that's where I see where the interest from the community and from many communities come from, because there is just so much in there.
Yeah.
That's all I wanted to say. No guilt.
Thank you. I mean, I didn't anticipate that project when I did it, which was when I was still a graduate student, that it would be so formative in my own thinking about how books function and what they can be and do. And it was a creative project that was also, for me, very investigative, and it changed my path in ways that I wouldn't have anticipated at the time.
I mean, they're so related, right? I mean, creative practice and research in a way that we're also trying to do in this class, but I think our own practices, right? We all kind of do this in one way or another. Yeah. But I think Élika has our last question. We're going to finish.
Yep. And it's exactly what it's exactly what we're talking about already. So at UW Bothell, you teach really hands-on courses. I have the titles of them: Advanced Arts Workshop, Chapbooks and Artist Books, and another one called Literary and Arts Journals, which sound awesome, by the way, but also make students really get into the nitty-gritty of both publishing a journal and making us writing and just wonderful things. So can you tell us a little bit about, and can you tell our students, which we'll love to hear this, I think, about how, what they stand to learn with these approaches, rather than the most common ways of doing research and scholarship?
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming that we have very similar philosophies in this regard, that in order to understand a lot of the work that we study, you sort of have to have some sense of what went into making it a material reality. And the best way for many of us to do that is either to reverse engineer it or to rebuild it from the ground up. And so I like to incorporate into my classes opportunities for students to really get hands-on making experience, what some scholars call critical making, where you're fabricating something from the standpoint of trying to understand it more deeply, in the same way that, like, writing a sonnet helps you understand better what Shakespeare was up to. It's sort of like, once you dip your toe in, then you have a feeling of like, oh, that's the temperature of the water. And I do think that with the chapbooks and artist books class, where basically every week it's a creative writing workshop, and every week we read a chapbook by a contemporary writer, and we talk about the chapbook and, like, sort of how it's structured, how the poems in it came together, what kind of overall narrative or feeling it's giving us. And then we also learn a different bookbinding technique, and students have to create a chapbook using this new technique. One of the things that class does is it makes creative writers think about their work not just as words, but as a whole artifact that's going to come into the world fully formed. And I have found that in classes like that, not only are the physical artifacts really interesting, but the poems get more interesting too, because the students are thinking about them both in a kind of like interlinked way, where they have an arc and they have a theme or a connection, but that also they're thinking about materiality. And so the poems can experiment with language and can experiment with form in ways they might not have otherwise been driven to. But that when you do something like force yourself to write using a roll of paper tape that would go in a receipt printer, right? That physical form challenges you in the same way a constraint like the sonnet or an Oulipo N+7 challenges you to think about your poem differently, because you have to accommodate this material form. So I found, those challenges can lead to some really, really interesting results that one might not otherwise have thought to put together.
Totally.
Can we be your students?
Yeah.
Can I be your students?
Everybody.
Sure, yeah. Let's all take
Well, maybe that's the future of online learning.
Well,
All one
I mean,
classroom.
I mean, talking really about sort of the affordances that we have and how to like exploit them. I mean, when we knew we were going to teach remotely, we thought, okay, let's make a class that can only be taught remotely. What are the things that you could only do this way? Oh, well, we can teach from 2 different universities, 2 different places, 2 different time zones. Well, let's do it. We can invite anybody we want that accepts to come, and all these things. So it allows us to create a new structure, a new form, and that is also proving to be very creative and very productive. I mean, I'm super excited. So yeah, it's the same kind of philosophy. And with that, I think we'll finish. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk, and thank you. And we may call on you again for something, I don't know.
Feel free, yeah. And if there are follow-up questions, you've got my email too. So don't hesitate. I'm really honored. Thank you.
I think what we'll do too is after this is shared with the class, you may get questions from them as well.
Terrific. Okay. I welcome that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, bye.
Bye.